The howling wind carried ice crystals that cut across Sarah Lawson's face like tiny shards of glass as she stumbled through the Montana wilderness, knowing with terrible certainty that she was about to die. November of 1883 had brought an early blizzard to the territory, and she had been foolish enough to think she could make the journey from Virginia City to her uncle's ranch before the storm hit in earnest. She had been wrong. Sarah clutched her thin coat tighter around her body, but it did nothing against the wind that seemed determined to strip the warmth from her bones. Her horse had thrown a shoe 5 miles back, then stumbled into a prairie dog hole and broken its leg. She had wept as she walked away from the animal, unable to do what needed to be done, leaving it to the mercy of the storm instead. The guilt gnawed at her almost as much as the cold. The world had become nothing but white. White sky, white ground, white air thick with snow that made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Sarah had lost all sense of direction an hour ago. She was simply walking now, putting one foot in front of the other because stopping meant freezing to death where she stood. Her feet had gone numb inside her boots. Her fingers felt like wooden sticks at the ends of her hands. Even her thoughts were beginning to slow, becoming thick and syrupy like molasses in winter. She knew these were signs of freezing, that her body was shutting down piece by piece, but there was nothing she could do about it. Through the whiteout, something dark appeared. Sarah blinked, sure it was a hallucination brought on by the cold. But the shape remained, growing more solid as she staggered toward it. A building. A cabin, squat and sturdy with smoke rising from a stone chimney. She wanted to cry with relief, but even her tears seemed frozen. Sarah forced her legs to move faster, though they felt like lead weights. She had to reach that door, had to get inside, had to survive. The porch steps nearly defeated her. Her numb feet caught on the first one and she fell forward, catching herself on her hands. The impact should have hurt, but she felt nothing. Sarah crawled up the remaining steps and threw herself against the wooden door, pounding on it with fists she could barely feel. "Help," she tried to call out, but her voice was barely a whisper. "Please." The door opened so suddenly that Sarah fell forward into warmth and light and the smell of coffee and wood smoke. Strong hands caught her before she hit the floor. "Jesus Christ," a man's voice said, rough with surprise. "Where the hell did you come from?" Sarah tried to answer, but her jaw was too stiff with cold. She looked up at her rescuer and saw a man in his late 20s with dark hair that fell past his collar and eyes the color of whiskey in sunlight. His face was weathered by sun and wind, with a few days' worth of stubble on his jaw. "Can you walk?" he asked, and when she didn't respond, he simply swept her up into his arms and carried her further into the cabin. He set her down in a chair near the fireplace, and immediately began working at the buttons of her coat with quick, efficient movements. "Need to get these wet clothes off you," he said, his voice all business. "You are half frozen. What is your name?" "Sarah," she managed through chattering teeth. "Sarah L. Lawson." "Frank Reynolds," he said, pulling her coat off and tossing it aside. "I am going to get you some dry clothes. Do not fall asleep, you hear me? Stay awake." He disappeared into another room while Sarah sat shivering violently in front of the fire. The warmth was almost painful against her frozen skin, pins and needles shooting through her fingers and toes as sensation began to return. She looked around the cabin through blurry eyes. It was small but well-maintained, with a pot-bellied stove in one corner, a rough wooden table and chairs, and a bed against the far wall covered in thick quilts. Frank returned with what looked like one of his own shirts and a pair of wool pants. "These will be too big, but they are dry. Can you manage to change yourself, or do you need help?" Sarah's face flushed hot despite the cold still gripping her. "I can manage. I will turn around," Frank said, suiting action to words. But be quick about it. Frostbite is nothing to take lightly." With shaking hands, Sarah peeled off her wet dress and undergarments, too desperate for warmth to feel properly modest. She pulled on Frank's clothes, which were indeed far too large, but they were dry and still held warmth from wherever he had been keeping them. She had to roll up the sleeves and pant legs multiple times. "I am decent," she said, and Frank turned around. His expression was serious as he knelt down in front of her and took her hands in his, examining her fingers carefully. "No blackening," he said. "That is good. Let me see your feet." Sarah hesitated, but Frank was already unlacing her wet boots and pulling them off along with her soaked stockings. His hands were warm and calloused as he examined her toes, checking each one. The intimacy of the gesture should have scandalized her, but Sarah was too grateful to be alive to care about propriety. "You were lucky," Frank said, sitting back on his heels. "Another hour out there and you would have lost fingers or toes, maybe your life." He stood and went to the stove, pouring something from a pot into a tin cup. "Drink this. It is just broth, but it will warm you from the inside." Sarah took the cup in both hands, savoring the warmth against her palms. The broth was simple but good, rich with the flavor of beef and vegetables. She sipped it slowly, feeling the heat spread through her chest and belly. "Thank you," she said, her voice stronger now. "I thought I was going to die out there." "You nearly did," Frank said bluntly. He pulled up another chair and sat across from her, his amber eyes studying her face. "What the hell were you doing out in this storm?" "I was trying to reach my uncle's ranch," Sarah explained. "He has a place about 15 miles east of Virginia City. I was staying in town, but he sent word that he had taken ill and needed help. I thought I could beat the storm." "That was foolish," Frank said, but his tone was not unkind. "This country does not forgive mistakes like that, especially not in winter." "I know that now," Sarah said quietly. She looked down at the cup in her hands. "My horse broke its leg. I had to leave it." "There was nothing else you could do," Frank said. "Could you have put it down?" Sarah shook her head, ashamed. "I do not know how. I have never shot a gun." Frank's expression softened slightly. "You are not from around here, I take it." "Boston," Sarah admitted. "I came west 6 months ago after my parents died. My uncle is my only living relative." "That explains the accent," Frank said, "and the lack of sense about traveling in a blizzard." Despite everything, Sarah felt a flash of irritation. "I am not completely foolish." The storm came up faster than the weather predicted. "Weather out here does not care about predictions," Frank said, but there was a hint of amusement in his eyes now. "You learn to read the sky yourself, or you end up dead." The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and making the cabin's walls creak. Sarah shuddered, imagining herself still out in that frozen hell. "How long do you think the storm will last?" she asked. Frank stood and walked to the window, peering out at the white void beyond. "Hard to say. Could be a day, could be 3, maybe more. We are snowed in until it passes and the drifts settle enough for travel." Sarah's stomach dropped. 3 days, but my uncle needs me. He is sick." "Your uncle will have to wait," Frank said firmly. "There is no way anyone is going anywhere in this. Even if the storm passed right now, the snow will be too deep for travel until it settles or we get a thaw. You will stay here until it is safe." "I cannot impose on you for 3 days," Sarah protested. Frank turned to look at her, one eyebrow raised. "You do not have a choice. Unless you would prefer to head back out into that." He gestured to the window. Sarah bit her lip, knowing he was right but hating the feeling of helplessness. She was already imposing on this stranger, relying on his charity for her very survival. "I am sorry for the burden." "Did not say you were a burden," Frank said gruffly. "Just stating facts. You are stuck here and I am stuck with you. We will make the best of it." He moved around the cabin with an easy familiarity, stirring something in a pot on the stove, checking the fire, making small adjustments that spoke of long practice at living alone. Sarah watched him, trying to get a sense of the man who had saved her life. He was tall and lean, with the kind of rangy build that came from hard physical work. His clothes were worn but clean, practical working garb with no frills. There was a gun belt hanging on a peg near the door, and a rifle mounted above the fireplace. He moved with a quiet confidence that suggested he was comfortable in his own skin, at ease with solitude. "What do you do out here?" Sarah asked. "This is quite isolated." "I ranch," Frank said. "Have about 200 head of cattle on the land around this cabin. Come winter, I stay here and make sure none of them get stuck in drifts or picked off by wolves." "You do this alone?" "Hired men work the ranch in summer," Frank explained. "But winter is a one-man operation. I prefer it that way." There was something in his tone that discouraged further questions, so Sarah fell silent. She finished her broth and set the cup aside, feeling warmth and exhaustion wash over her in equal measure. Her body felt heavy, her eyelids drooping. "You can take the bed," Frank said, noticing. "You need proper sleep to recover." "I cannot take your bed," Sarah protested. "Where will you sleep?" "I have a bedroll," Frank said. "I will be fine on the floor. Do not argue. You nearly froze to death. You need rest." Sarah was too tired to protest further. She stood on shaky legs and made her way to the bed, which was covered in heavy quilts that promised warmth and comfort. She crawled under them, still wearing Frank's oversized clothes, and felt the softness of the mattress beneath her. It smelled like wood smoke and leather and something indefinably masculine. "Thank you," she said softly, "for saving my life." Frank was laying out his bedroll near the fire. He glanced over at her, his expression unreadable in the firelight. "You are welcome. Now sleep." Sarah closed her eyes and was unconscious within moments, her exhausted body finally able to rest now that she was warm and safe. When she woke, gray daylight was filtering through the windows, though the storm still raged outside. Sarah sat up slowly, her body aching in a dozen places. Frank was at the stove, cooking something that smelled wonderful. He must have heard her stirring because he spoke without turning around. "There is a basin of warm water on the table if you want to wash up. Chamber pot is under the bed." Sarah felt her face heat at his casual mention of such intimate necessities, but she supposed there was no room for false modesty when sharing a one-room cabin. She got out of bed and made use of the facilities, then washed her face and hands in the warm water, grateful for the simple luxury. "How long did I sleep?" she asked. "About 14 hours, Frank said. "It is mid-morning now. I checked your fingers and toes while you were asleep. No frostbite." The thought of him touching her while she slept should have bothered Sarah, but she found she trusted that he had been purely practical about it. There was something solid and dependable about Frank Reynolds, a straightforward quality that suggested he did not play games or have hidden motives. "What are you making?" she asked, coming to stand near the stove. "Biscuits and salt pork," Frank said. "Nothing fancy, but it is hot and filling." Sarah watched him work, noticing the competence in his movements. "You are a good cook." "Man lives alone, he learns to cook or he starves," Frank said. "Can you cook?" "Some," Sarah admitted. "My mother taught me basic things before she died. I am better at sewing than cooking." "Sewing does not fill your belly," Frank said, but there was no judgment in his voice. He plated up the food and handed her a tin plate. "Eat." They sat at the table together, and Sarah discovered she was ravenously hungry. The simple food tasted better than the finest meal she had eaten in Boston. She ate quickly, then felt embarrassed at her lack of manners. "I apologize. I am eating like a field hand." "You nearly died yesterday," Frank said. "Your body needs fuel. No shame in that. After breakfast, Sarah helped Frank clean up, learning the routine of the cabin. Water had to be melted from snow for washing. Dishes had to be scrubbed with sand and soap made from lye. Everything had to be put away carefully, kept organized in the small space. "Tell me about your uncle," Frank said as they worked. "What is wrong with him?" "I do not know exactly," Sarah admitted. His letter just said he had taken ill and needed someone to help run the household. His wife died 2 years ago, and he has been alone ever since. "What is his name?" "Walter Lawson. He has a ranch called the Twisted Pine, about 15 miles from Virginia City." Frank nodded slowly. "I know of it. Good land from what I hear. Your uncle has a reputation as a fair man." "You have never met him. I keep to myself mostly," Frank said. "Only go into town for supplies a few times a year." "That sounds lonely," Sarah said before she could stop herself. Frank gave her a long look. "Lonely and alone are not the same thing. I like the quiet, gives a man time to think." "What do you think about?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious. Frank shrugged. "The cattle, the weather, how to improve the ranch, whether the supply of coffee will last through winter." He paused. Not much use thinking about other things. There was a weight to those last words, a hint of old pain that made Sarah wonder what had driven Frank to this isolated existence. But she sensed it was not the time to ask. The day passed slowly. The storm continued to rage outside, the wind screaming around the cabin's corners and piling snow against the walls. Inside, Sarah and Frank settled into an awkward domesticity, two strangers forced together by circumstances. Frank spent time checking his gear, oiling his saddle, sharpening his knife. Sarah found a basket of mending in the corner and asked if she could work on it. Frank seemed surprised but grateful, and she spent several hours stitching up tears in his shirts and pants, making neat repairs that would hold for years. "You are not lying about being good at sewing," Frank commented, examining one of the repaired shirts. "It is one of the few useful skills I have for this country," Sarah said. "I am learning that most of my education was not practical." "What did they teach you in Boston?" Frank asked. "French, piano, poetry, watercolors," Sarah listed. "How to pour tea properly and make polite conversation at dinner parties, none of which helps me in Montana. Can you read and write?" "Of course." "Then you have the most important skills," Frank said. "Rest can be learned." They shared dinner that evening, and Sarah found herself actually enjoying the conversation. Frank was not talkative by nature, but when he did speak, his words had weight. He told her about the ranch, about the rhythm of the seasons, about the challenges of keeping cattle alive through brutal winters. "Why do you do it?" Sarah asked. "It sounds incredibly difficult." "It is honest work," Frank said simply. "You put in the effort, you get results. The land does not lie to you. Cattle do not pretend to be something they are not. There is a purity to it." "You do not like people much," Sarah observed. Frank met her eyes across the table. "People have given me reasons not to trust them. Cattle have not." Sarah wanted to ask what those reasons were, but something in his expression stopped her. Instead, she said, "Not everyone is untrustworthy." "Maybe," Frank said, "but it takes a long time to know which is which." That night, as Sarah lay in Frank's bed again and listened to the storm outside, she found herself thinking about her rescuer. There was something compelling about him, something that went beyond his obvious physical strength and competence. He had depth, hidden layers that he kept carefully concealed. She fell asleep wondering what had hurt him badly enough to send him into self-imposed isolation. The next day, the storm finally began to ease. The wind died down to occasional gusts, and the snow fell more gently, no longer a blinding wall of white. Frank stood at the window for a long time, studying the sky. "Another day and I will be able to check on the herd," he said. Maybe 2 days after that, before the snow settles enough for you to travel. I should try to send word to my uncle, Sarah said. He will be worried. No way to do that until the weather clears, Frank said. He will understand. Anyone with sense knows not to expect travel in a blizzard. Sarah spent the day helping Frank prepare for when he could go outside again. She helped him organize his gear, check his supplies, and prepare feed for the horse he kept in a small lean-to behind the cabin. You are going to freeze out there checking on cattle, Sarah said, eyeing his coat critically. Let me reinforce this before you go. She examined the worn fabric, noting where the insulation was failing. Do you have any spare wool or cotton batting? Frank found some, and Sarah spent the afternoon carefully adding reinforcement to his coat, making sure every seam was solid and every gap sealed. When she handed it back to him, Frank put it on and looked genuinely pleased. This is better than when I bought it new, he said. Now you might actually stay warm, Sarah said, feeling a small glow of pride at being useful. That evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Frank surprised her by pulling out a harmonica and playing a soft, melancholy tune. Sarah listened, entranced by the haunting melody. That is beautiful, she said when he finished. What is it called? Nothing, Frank said, just something I play sometimes. You made it up, he nodded, looking slightly uncomfortable with the attention. Music is another way to fill the quiet. Will you play more? Sarah asked. Frank played several more tunes, some sad, some livelier. Sarah found herself relaxing completely for the first time since she had arrived, letting the music wash over her. When he finally put the harmonica away, she felt almost disappointed. Thank you for sharing that, she said. You are very talented. Frank shrugged, but she could see he was pleased. My mother played piano. She taught me to hear music, even if I never learned proper instruments. It was the first personal thing he had volunteered about his past, and Sarah treasured the small glimpse into who he had been before the isolation. What happened to her? Sarah asked gently. Died when I was 16, Frank said. Fever took her fast. My father followed 6 months later. Could not live without her. I am sorry, Sarah said, understanding that kind of loss intimately. My parents died within a year of each other too. Father had a bad heart. Mother just seemed to fade away after he was gone. They sat in companionable silence for a while, two people who understood the particular pain of being alone in the world. Is that why you came west? Frank asked. Because there was nothing left for you in Boston, partly, Sarah admitted, but also because I wanted something different. Boston felt suffocating, all those rules and expectations. I thought out here I could breathe. And can you? Sarah thought about it. I am learning. It is harder than I expected, but also more real. Does that make sense? It does, Frank said, and his smile was genuine this time, transforming his weathered face into something warmer. You might make a Westerner yet, Sarah Lawson. The next morning dawned clear and brutally cold. Frank bundled up in his reinforced coat and headed out to check on his cattle, leaving Sarah alone in the cabin. She spent the time productively, cleaning thoroughly and making a proper stew from the supplies she found, wanting to contribute something beyond mending. When Frank returned hours later, he was covered in snow and ice, his face reddened by the cold, but he was also smiling. Lost 3 head in a drift, he reported, stamping snow off his boots. But the rest are fine. That is better than I feared, he sniffed the air. Something smells good. I made stew, Sarah said. I hope you do not mind that I used your supplies. Mind? Woman, you just made yourself worth your keep, Frank said, going straight to the stove. He ladled out a large bowl and took a bite, then closed his eyes. This is the best thing I have eaten in 6 months. Sarah laughed, pleased by his obvious enjoyment. It is just stew. "It is food that tastes like someone who knows how to cook made it," Frank said. "Big difference from what I throw together." They ate together, and Sarah found herself watching the way Frank's face relaxed as he ate, the tension easing from his shoulders. She realized with a start that she liked him, genuinely liked him, not just as a rescuer but as a person. He was direct and honest, with a dry sense of humor that caught her by surprise. And there was a kindness in him that he tried to hide but could not quite manage. That night, as Sarah lay in bed and Frank settled into his bedroll by the fire, she spoke into the darkness. "Frank?" "Yeah." "Thank you, not just for saving my life but for making this bearable. You have been kind." There was a long pause. "You are easy to have around, for someone from Boston." Sarah smiled in the darkness. From Frank, that was high praise. The following day brought more clear weather, though the cold remained fierce. Frank announced that Sarah would be able to leave the next morning if she wanted. "The snow has settled enough for travel," he said. "I will take you to your uncle's ranch myself. Cannot have you getting lost again." Sarah should have been relieved. She had been here 3 days, an imposition on Frank's solitude. She had been desperate to reach her uncle. But instead of relief, she felt an unexpected pang of disappointment. "You do not have to do that," she said. "If you point me in the right direction, I am taking you," Frank said firmly. "No arguments. Besides, I need to go into Virginia City for supplies soon anyway. Your uncle's ranch is on the way." That last part was likely not true, but Sarah did not argue. The truth was, she was not ready to say goodbye yet. The thought of leaving this small cabin and its taciturn occupant bothered her more than it should. She spent the day preparing for departure, helping Frank pack supplies for the journey. He had a spare horse that he would lend her for the trip, and he meticulously checked all the gear to make sure everything was safe. As evening fell, Sarah felt the weight of the approaching goodbye settling over her. She would likely never see Frank again after tomorrow. He would retreat into his isolation, and she would go to her uncle's ranch to build a new life. The thought made her inexplicably sad. "Frank," she said as they finished dinner, "would you play your harmonica one more time? I would like to remember it." Frank's eyes met hers, and she saw understanding there. He pulled out the harmonica and played, the notes sweet and sorrowful in the firelight. Sarah closed her eyes and let herself feel the music, memorizing this moment. When he finished, she opened her eyes to find him watching her with an expression she could not quite read. "Sarah," he said, then stopped. He seemed to be struggling with words, this man who spoke so sparingly. "These 3 days, having you here, it was not the burden I expected." "I am glad," Sarah said softly. "It was not the ordeal I feared either." They looked at each other across the firelight, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, a possibility, a question neither was quite ready to ask. "You should sleep," Frank said finally. "Long ride tomorrow." Sarah nodded and went to bed, but sleep was long in coming. She lay awake, listening to Frank move around the cabin, banking the fire and checking the door. When he finally settled into his bedroll, she heard him shift restlessly, as if he too could not quite settle. In the morning, they prepared to leave in near silence. Sarah put on her own dress, which Frank had dried and brushed clean. It felt strange after 3 days in his oversized clothes, like she was putting on an old identity that no longer fit quite right. Frank saddled both horses while Sarah gathered the few belongings she had. When everything was ready, she took one last look around the cabin that had been her refuge. "Ready?" Frank asked from the doorway. "Ready," Sarah said, though she was not sure it was true. They rode out into a world transformed by snow. Everything was white and pristine, beautiful in the morning sunlight but treacherous beneath. Frank led the way, his horse breaking trail through the drifts while Sarah followed on the borrowed mount. The journey to her uncle's ranch should have taken about 4 hours. They rode in silence mostly. Frank focused on navigating safely while Sarah tried to memorize the landscape, to fix this journey in her memory. Around midday, they stopped to rest the horses and eat the cold biscuits Frank had packed. They stood in the lee of a rock formation, protected from the wind, and Sarah tried to find the courage to say what she was thinking. "Frank," she began, then hesitated. He looked at her, his amber eyes patient. "Could I write to you?" she asked. "I know you like your solitude, but I thought perhaps letters would not be too intrusive." Frank was quiet for a long moment. "I do not get mail out at the ranch, would have to pick it up in town." "Oh," Sarah said, trying to hide her disappointment. "Of course." But Frank continued, "I could make a point of going into town more regular, say once a month, if I knew there might be something worth collecting." Sarah's heart lifted. "You would do that?" "Seems a shame to let a friendship end just because a storm passed," Frank said, not quite meeting her eyes. "A friendship," Sarah repeated, testing the word. "Yes, I would like that." They remounted and continued on, but something had shifted. The silence between them felt different now, charged with potential rather than ending. When they finally reached the Twisted Pine Ranch, Sarah was struck by how different it looked from Frank's small cabin. This was a proper ranch complex with a large house, barn, bunkhouse, and multiple outbuildings. Smoke rose from the chimney of the main house. "Your uncle does well for himself," Frank observed. They rode up to the house, and the front door opened before they could dismount. A man in his 50s emerged, thin and pale but clearly recovering from whatever illness had plagued him. "Sarah," Walter Lawson called out, "thank God you are all right. When the storm hit and you had not arrived, I feared the worst." Sarah dismounted and went to embrace her uncle. "I am fine, Uncle Walter. Thanks to Mr. Reynolds here, he saved my life." Walter turned to Frank, his expression serious. "Then you have my deepest gratitude, sir. Please come inside, both of you. You must be frozen." "I cannot stay long," Frank said. "Need to get back before dark." "Nonsense," Walter said firmly. "You will stay for a hot meal at least. I insist. It is the least I can do for the man who saved my niece's life." Frank looked like he wanted to refuse, but Sarah caught his eye and gave him a small, pleading look. He sighed and dismounted. "One meal," he agreed. Inside, the house was warm and well-appointed, far more luxurious than Frank's cabin. Walter's housekeeper, a sturdy woman named Mrs. Chen, immediately set about preparing food while Walter ushered them into the parlor. "Tell me everything," Walter said, settling into a chair. "How did you come to find my niece?" Frank recounted the story briefly, leaving out most of the details. Sarah filled in more, describing the storm and her foolish decision to travel, Frank's rescue, and the 3 days they had spent waiting out the weather. "You are a good man, Mr. Reynolds," Walter said when they finished. "How can I repay you?" "No repayment necessary," Frank said uncomfortably. "Anyone would have done the same." "Perhaps, but you were the one who did it," Walter insisted. "At least let me compensate you for your time and supplies." "I do not want money," Frank said firmly. An awkward silence fell. Sarah could see her uncle wanted to do something, and Frank was too proud to accept charity. She spoke up. "Frank has agreed to let me write to him," she said. "Perhaps we could arrange for his mail to be delivered here instead of him having to go all the way into Virginia City. It would make correspondence easier." Walter seized on the suggestion. "Excellent idea. We get mail delivery twice a month. It would be no trouble at all to hold Mr. Reynolds' letters, and of course you would be welcome to stop by to collect them. Stay for dinner, visit a while." Frank looked trapped but also oddly pleased. "That would be acceptable." "Wonderful," Walter said. "Then it is settled. You will be a regular visitor, I hope." Mrs. Chen announced that dinner was ready, and they moved to the dining room. The meal was substantial roasted chicken, potatoes, vegetables, fresh bread. Frank ate with obvious appreciation, though Sarah noticed he seemed uncomfortable with the formal setting. After dinner, Frank stood to leave. "I really do need to get back." Sarah walked him out to his horse, her uncle tactfully staying inside. The sun was already sinking toward the horizon, painting the snow pink and gold. "Thank you again," Sarah said, "for everything." "You already thanked me," Frank said, checking his saddle with practiced movements. "I know, but I want to make sure you understand. You did not just save my life. You gave me 3 days of peace when I needed it. That is worth more than I can say." Frank looked at her then, really looked at her, and Sarah felt her breath catch. In the fading light, his eyes seemed to glow. "Write to me," he said. "Tell me how you settle in here. If your uncle is treating you well, if you need anything." "I will," Sarah promised. "And you write back. Tell me about the ranch, about the cattle, about whatever you are thinking in all that quiet." "That could be a lot of letters," Frank said with a hint of humor. "I am not afraid of a lot of letters," Sarah replied. Frank mounted his horse, then looked down at her. "Sarah Lawson from Boston, you are tougher than you look." "Frank Reynolds, the hermit rancher," Sarah shot back with a smile. "You are softer than you pretend." He actually laughed at that, a real laugh that transformed his face. "Do not tell anyone. Would ruin my reputation." Then he was riding away, his horse's hooves muffled by the snow. Sarah watched until he disappeared into the gathering dusk, already counting the days until the next mail delivery. The following weeks fell into a rhythm. Sarah settled into life at her uncle's ranch, learning the household routines and helping where she could. Walter was kind but often distant, still grieving his wife and uncertain how to relate to his young niece. The ranch kept him busy, and Sarah found herself with considerable free time. She filled that time with letters to Frank. At first, she wrote carefully, conscious of not being too familiar or presumptuous. She described her daily activities, asked polite questions about his cattle and the weather. His responses were brief but thoughtful, written in a surprisingly neat hand that suggested education beyond what she might have expected. But as the weeks turned into months, the letters changed. Sarah began to write more openly, sharing her thoughts and feelings, her struggles with adjusting to Western life, her occasional homesickness for Boston despite not wanting to return. And Frank, slowly, began to open up in return. He wrote about his childhood, about growing up on his parents' small farm in Missouri, about how he had come west after they died seeking something he could not quite name. He described the beauty of the Montana landscape in different seasons, wrote prose that was almost poetic about dawn over the mountains and the sound of wind through pines. Sarah treasured every letter, reading them multiple times, analyzing every word for hidden meaning. She told herself it was just friendship, that she was simply grateful to the man who had saved her life. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. February brought the first mail delivery that Frank came to collect in person. Sarah was helping Mrs. Chen in the kitchen when she heard horses in the yard. She looked out the window and felt her heart leap when she recognized Frank's tall figure dismounting. "Someone is here," she said to Mrs. Chen, trying to sound casual. "That will be Mr. Reynolds," Mrs. Chen said with a knowing smile. "He sent word he would be by today." Sarah untied her apron with shaking hands. "I should go greet him, be polite." "Of course," Mrs. Chen said, her smile widening. "Very polite." Sarah found Frank in the parlor with her uncle, accepting a cup of coffee. He stood when she entered and their eyes met across the room. "Miss Lawson," he said formally. "Mr. Reynolds," she replied. "How nice to see you." "I came for my mail," he said, "and to bring you a letter." He handed her an envelope, and Sarah noticed his fingers lingered against hers for just a moment longer than necessary. She felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Thank you," she managed. "Stay for dinner, Frank," Walter said. "I want to discuss some cattle matters with you." Frank agreed, and the afternoon passed in pleasant conversation. Sarah sat and listened as the men talked about ranching, learning more about the business that sustained this country. Frank caught her eye several times, and each time she felt that same flutter in her chest. When Frank finally left as evening fell, he paused to speak to Sarah alone in the hallway. "Your letters," he said quietly. "I look forward to them." "As do I to yours," Sarah said. "They are the best part of mail delivery." "Sarah," Frank began, then stopped. He seemed to wrestle with something internal. "Could I call on you sometimes? Proper like, not just for mail delivery?" Sarah felt joy bloom in her chest. "I would like that very much." "Your uncle would not object." "My uncle wants me to be happy," Sarah said. "And you make me happy, Frank Reynolds." His face softened. "You make me happy too. Did not think that was possible anymore, but there it is." He left then, but Sarah stood in the hallway for long minutes afterward, hugging his words to herself like a treasure. Frank began visiting regularly after that, sometimes for mail delivery, sometimes just to call on Sarah properly. Walter observed their growing attachment with quiet approval, telling Sarah that Frank was a good man, the kind who would keep his word and treat her right. Spring came slowly to Montana, the snow retreating inch by stubborn inch. As the land warmed and turned green, Sarah and Frank's relationship deepened. They took walks together around the ranch property, talking for hours about everything and nothing. Frank taught her about the land, pointing out animal tracks and explaining how to read weather in the clouds. Sarah shared her love of books with him, lending him volumes from her uncle's library and discussing them at length. One evening in late April, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky impossible colors, Frank took Sarah's hand in his. It was the first time he had touched her beyond a polite handshake, and the contact sent electricity through her. "I need to tell you something," Frank said, his voice serious. Sarah's heart pounded. "What is it?" "I am not good with words, not the kind that matter anyway." Frank took a breath. "I came out here to be alone because I thought that was what I wanted. Thought I was done with people, with caring, with all of it." "What changed?" Sarah asked softly. "You," Frank said simply. "Stumbling half-frozen into my cabin, too stubborn to die, you changed everything." "Frank, let me finish," he interrupted gently. "I have been alone for 5 years, Sarah. Chose it, wanted it. But these past months, getting to know you, spending time with you, I do not want to be alone anymore. I want to build something with someone. With you, if you will have me." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "Are you asking what I think you are asking?" "I am asking if you would consider marrying me," Frank said. "I know I am not much, just a rancher with a small herd in a cabin that is barely more than a shack. I do not have fancy manners or money or prospects beyond hard work and hope. But I can promise you honesty, loyalty, everything I have and am." "Frank," Sarah said, squeezing his hand, "you are everything I want, yes, 1,000 times yes." He pulled her into his arms then, and they held each other as the sun set and the stars began to emerge. Sarah felt like she had finally found home, not in a place but in a person. They were married in May, a simple ceremony in Virginia City with her uncle and a few of Frank's ranching neighbors in attendance. Sarah wore a simple dress she had sewn herself, and Frank wore a new suit that made him visibly uncomfortable. But when he said his vows, his voice was steady and sure. After the ceremony, they returned to Frank's cabin, their cabin now. Sarah had visited it several times since that first storm, but moving in permanently was different. This was where she would build her life. "It is smaller than I remembered," she said, looking around the single room. "We can build on," Frank said. "Add another room or two." I have been saving money. It will not be a mansion, but it can be comfortable. It is already perfect, Sarah said, turning to face him, because you are here. Their wedding night was tender and sweet, two people learning each other in the most intimate way possible. Frank was gentle, patient, making sure Sarah felt safe and cherished. Afterward, they lay tangled together under the quilts, listening to the wind outside. I love you, Frank said into the darkness. Should have said it before, but I am saying it now. I love you, Sarah. I love you too, Sarah replied, her heart full to bursting. I think I have since that first night when you saved my life. Then we have been in love for 6 months already, Frank said. Seems like we are off to a good start. Sarah laughed and kissed him, and they made love again, slower this time, savoring each touch and whispered endearment. Life as Frank's wife was hard work but deeply satisfying. Sarah learned to be a rancher's helpmeet, rising before dawn to make breakfast, helping with the endless chores that came with running a cattle operation. Frank taught her to ride properly, to handle a gun, to read the signs of weather and season. She became competent and confident in ways she never had been in Boston. But more than that, she was happy. Deliriously, completely happy in a way she had not known was possible. Frank was a good husband, considerate and loving. He talked more with her than he probably had in the previous 5 years combined, sharing his thoughts and dreams. They built a partnership based on mutual respect and genuine affection. In the evenings, after the work was done, they would sit together and talk or read. Frank played his harmonica while Sarah sewed. They made plans for the ranch's future, discussed which cattle to sell and which to keep for breeding, debated whether to expand their herd or improve their existing stock first. We should think about building a proper house, Frank said one night in July. Something with separate rooms, a real kitchen. Why? Sarah asked, though her heart was already racing with hope. Frank reached over and placed his hand on her still flat belly. We are going to need the space. Sarah covered his hand with hers. You know, you have been sick every morning for 2 weeks, Frank said with a gentle smile. And you get this look on your face sometimes like you are hugging a secret. I was going to tell you tonight, Sarah said. I am about 3 months along, I think. The baby should come in January. Frank pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. A baby, our baby. Are you happy? Sarah asked, though she could feel the answer in the way he held her. Happy does not begin to cover it, Frank said. Terrified, maybe. What do I know about raising a child? We will learn together, Sarah promised, just like we learned everything else. They began building the new house in August, working with a crew of men Frank hired from Virginia City. It went up slowly but steadily, a 2-story structure with 4 rooms downstairs and 2 up, plus a proper kitchen and indoor pump for water. It felt like a palace compared to the cabin. The cabin can be a bunkhouse for hired men, Frank said as they watched the construction. When we can afford to hire them year-round. Look at us, Sarah said, leaning against him, building an empire. More like a decent living, Frank said, but she could hear the pride in his voice. But it is ours. That counts for something. They moved into the new house in October, just as the weather was beginning to turn cold. Sarah was heavily pregnant by then, moving slowly but determined to help make the new house a home. She hung curtains she had sewn, arranged furniture, created spaces that were warm and inviting. Walter visited frequently as the due date approached, worried about his niece but trying not to show it. You have a midwife lined up? He asked for the 3rd time. Mrs. Chen agreed to come stay for the birthing, Sarah assured him. And Frank has been reading every book on childbirth he could find in Virginia City. Not much help, those books, Frank muttered. Lot of words that do not tell you what to actually do. You will do fine, Sarah said, taking his hand. We both will. The baby came early, on a bitterly cold night in early January of 1885. Sarah's water broke just after dinner, and suddenly everything was happening at once. Frank sent a ranch hand racing to fetch Mrs. Chen while he tried to help Sarah, his face pale but his hands steady. "You are doing great," he kept saying as Sarah paced the bedroom, breathing through contractions. "So strong, so brave." "Easy for you to say," Sarah gasped. "You are not the one pushing a human being out of your body." Mrs. Chen arrived and took charge with calm efficiency, sending Frank downstairs to boil water and prepare clean linens. The labor was long and hard, lasting through the night and into the next morning. Frank refused to stay downstairs, coming up periodically to hold Sarah's hand and wipe her face with a cool cloth. Finally, as dawn broke on a new day, their son entered the world with a lusty cry. Sarah fell back against the pillows, exhausted and triumphant, as Mrs. Chen cleaned the baby and wrapped him in a blanket. "A boy," Mrs. Chen announced, placing the infant in Sarah's arms. "Strong and healthy." Sarah looked down at her son, at his tiny, perfect face and waving fists, and felt love crash over her like a wave. Frank knelt beside the bed, his expression one of absolute wonder as he gently touched the baby's soft hair. "He is beautiful," Frank whispered. "Perfect." "What should we name him?" Sarah asked. They had discussed names endlessly but never quite settled on one. Frank looked at his son, then at Sarah, and smiled. "Frederick," he said, "after my father, Frederick Walter for your uncle too." "Frederick Walter Reynolds," Sarah said, testing it. "I like it, Freddie for short." "Freddie," Frank repeated, and the baby seemed to respond to his father's voice, turning his head. Frank laughed, a sound of pure joy. "Hello, Freddie. Welcome to the world." The first months of Freddie's life were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. Sarah had never been so tired or so happy. Frank proved to be a devoted father, walking the floor with a crying baby at 3 in the morning, changing nappies without complaint, making funny faces to elicit smiles. "You are a natural," Sarah said one evening, watching him rock Freddie to sleep. "He is easy to love," Frank said simply. "Just like his mother." As winter gave way to spring, and then summer, they settled into a new rhythm. The ranch prospered, with Frank making shrewd decisions about breeding and sales that increased their profits. They hired 2 permanent hands and built a proper bunkhouse, expanding their operation gradually but steadily. Walter visited often, delighted with his great-nephew. He watched Frank and Sarah together with obvious satisfaction, pleased that his niece had found such happiness. "You made a good choice," he told Sarah one afternoon while Frank was out checking cattle. "Not many men would have taken in a half-frozen stranger and treated her with such decency." "I was the lucky one," Sarah said, watching through the window as Frank rode back toward the house, Freddie secured in a special sling against his chest. The sight made her heart swell. "He gave me everything I needed without even knowing it." Life continued its gentle rhythm through the seasons. Freddie grew from infant to toddler, a sturdy boy with his father's amber eyes and his mother's dark hair. He learned to walk by holding onto Frank's fingers, took his first steps toward Sarah's waiting arms, said "Papa" and "Mama" with equal enthusiasm. On a warm evening in September of 1886, Sarah sat on the porch of their house watching Frank play with Freddie in the yard. The little boy was chasing chickens, laughing with delight every time they fluttered away from him. Frank followed close behind, making sure he did not fall. Sarah rested her hand on her belly, feeling the flutter of the new life growing there. Another baby, due in the spring. She had not told Frank yet, wanting to be sure, but the signs were unmistakable. Frank looked up and caught her watching, his face breaking into one of those rare, full smiles that still had the power to take her breath away. He said something to Freddie and they walked over together, the boy holding his father's hand. "Time for bed, little man," Frank said, scooping Freddie up. The boy protested, but only half-heartedly, already rubbing his eyes. After they had put Freddie to bed, Frank and Sarah sat together on the porch in the gathering darkness. The air smelled of hay and horses and the particular scent of Montana summer. "I have something to tell you," Sarah said. Frank turned to look at her, his expression curious. "What is it?" "We are going to have another baby," Sarah said. "In April, I think." Frank's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, joy, concern. "Are you all right, healthy?" "I feel wonderful," Sarah assured him. "Better than with Freddie, actually." Frank pulled her close, his arms strong and warm around her. "Another child, another little person to love." "Does that scare you?" Sarah asked. "Terrifies me," Frank admitted. "But in the best way. Everything with you terrifies me in the best way." Sarah laughed and kissed him, tasting coffee and contentment. "I love you, Frank Reynolds." "Love you too, Sarah Reynolds," he said against her lips. "More than I thought it was possible to love anyone." Their second child, a daughter they named Margaret Rose, arrived on a sunny April morning in 1887. The birth was easier than Freddie's, and Sarah recovered quickly. Frank was smitten from the first moment he held his daughter, her tiny hand wrapping around his finger. "She has your nose," he said, studying her face intently. "And your stubborn chin," Sarah replied with a laugh. Freddie was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to help with everything. He would bring her toys, sing her nonsensical songs, and announce to everyone that Maggie was the best baby in the whole world. The years that followed were full and rich. The ranch continued to grow, allowing them to hire more help and improve their stock. Frank gained a reputation as a fair employer and a shrewd cattleman. Other ranchers sought his advice, and he gradually became less isolated, more part of the community. Sarah threw herself into motherhood and ranching with equal enthusiasm. She could ride and shoot as well as any of the hired hands, but she could also nurse a sick child through the night and produce a feast for unexpected guests. She was respected throughout the county as both capable and kind. In the summer of 1889, Sarah discovered she was pregnant again. This time the news was met with calm pleasure rather than surprise. "Starting to get the hang of this," Frank said with a grin. "We certainly are," Sarah agreed. "Though 3 children feels like quite the handful." "We can manage," Frank said confidently. "We can manage anything together." Their third child, a son they named Benjamin Thomas, arrived in February of 1890. He was a calm baby, content to watch the world with serious dark eyes that reminded Sarah of her father. Life settled into a comfortable pattern. The children grew, the ranch prospered, and Frank and Sarah's love deepened with each passing year. They had built something real and lasting out of that chance meeting during a blizzard 7 years ago. One evening in November of 1890, as the first snows of winter began to fall, Sarah and Frank stood on their porch watching their 3 children play in the yard. Freddie, now 5, was building a snow fort with Margaret's help. Benjamin was bundled in Sarah's arms, watching his siblings with wide eyes. "You remember the storm?" Sarah asked. "The one that brought me to your door." "Every detail," Frank said. "You were half dead, stubborn as a mule, and the most beautiful thing I had ever seen." Sarah laughed. "I was half frozen and desperate." "Still beautiful," Frank insisted. He put his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "Best thing that ever happened to me, that storm." "Best thing that happened to me too," Sarah said softly. "I thought I was going to die out there. Instead, I found life. Real life, the kind worth living." "We built a good life," Frank said. "Better than I dreamed possible." "We did," Sarah agreed. She looked out at their children, their home, the land they had tamed together. "And we are not done yet. There is so much more ahead." "Whatever comes, we will face it together," Frank said. And it was a promise he had kept every day since she stumbled into his cabin 7 years ago. As the snow fell softly around them and their children's laughter rang through the evening air, Sarah felt complete contentment settle over her. She had come west looking for something different, for a life less constrained than the one she left behind in Boston. She had found that and so much more. She had found Frank. She had found home. And she had discovered that sometimes the best things in life come from the worst circumstances, that beauty can emerge from survival, and that love can bloom even in the harshest winter. The years continued to pass with the steady rhythm of ranch life. The children grew healthy and strong. Freddie showed an early aptitude for working with horses, spending hours in the stable learning everything his father could teach him. Margaret developed her mother's skill with sewing and her father's love of music, often convincing Frank to play his harmonica while she sang. Benjamin, the quiet one, surprised everyone by proving to be gifted with numbers, keeping track of the ranch's accounts before he turned 8. Frank and Sarah watched their children grow with pride and wonder, amazed at how quickly time passed. The ranch expanded further, eventually encompassing nearly 5,000 acres and 600 head of cattle. They built a new, larger barn and added on to the house again, creating a library where Sarah could indulge her love of books and a proper music room where Margaret could practice the piano Frank surprised her with on her 10th birthday. Walter remained a constant presence in their lives until his death in 1895. He passed peacefully in his sleep, leaving his ranch to Sarah with the provision that she keep it in the family. Frank and Sarah decided to merge the two operations, making them one of the larger cattle concerns in that part of Montana. In the spring of 1896, Sarah discovered she was pregnant once more, a surprise given that Benjamin was already 6 years old. The pregnancy was harder than the previous ones and Frank worried constantly. But in December of that year, a healthy daughter named Caroline Grace entered the world, completing their family. 4 children, Frank said, holding his newest daughter while Sarah rested. "We have been blessed beyond measure." "We have," Sarah agreed. "Though I think we are done now. 4 is plenty," Frank laughed. 4 is perfect." As the new century approached, the Reynolds family was well established in the community. Frank served on the territorial council, working to help Montana gain statehood. Sarah organized a school district, ensuring that all the ranch children in the area had access to education. Their home became a gathering place, known for its hospitality and Sarah's excellent cooking. The children brought their own personalities and dreams to the family. Freddie announced at 15 that he wanted to be a rancher like his father, news that made Frank glow with pride. Margaret spoke of becoming a teacher, inspired by her mother's work with the school. Benjamin surprised everyone by declaring his intention to become a banker, seeing opportunities in the growing towns of Montana. Caroline, still young, changed her ambitions weekly but seemed drawn to medicine, always fascinated when the doctor came to treat anyone on the ranch. Through it all, Frank and Sarah's relationship remained the foundation of everything they built. They still took evening walks together when weather permitted, talking about their day and their dreams. Frank still played his harmonica for Sarah, though his hands were more weathered now and his hair had begun to gray at the temples. Sarah still mended his clothes, though they could afford to buy new ones, because she liked the quiet intimacy of the task. On a cold November evening in 1900, 17 years after the blizzard that had brought them together, Sarah and Frank sat in front of their fireplace. The children were all asleep upstairs. The house was quiet, and they had a rare moment of solitude. "You ever regret it?" Sarah asked. "Giving up your solitude for all this chaos?" Frank looked around at their comfortable home, thought of the children sleeping peacefully upstairs, and pulled Sarah closer to his side. "Not for a single second," he said firmly. "I thought I wanted to be alone, but I was just afraid. Afraid to care, to lose, to hurt again. You taught me that the risk is worth it, that love is always worth the risk. You taught me what strength really is," Sarah said. "Not just surviving, but thriving, building something beautiful even when it is hard. I was so lost when I came west, Frank. You helped me find myself." "We found each other," Frank corrected. "That storm brought you to my door for a reason." "Do you believe in fate?" Sarah asked. Frank considered the question seriously. "I believe in luck and timing and being brave enough to take what is offered. The storm was luck. You knocking on my door was timing. Everything after was us being brave enough to build this." Sarah kissed him then, a kiss that held 17 years of love and partnership and shared dreams. When they pulled apart, Frank rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Sarah Reynolds." From that first night to this moment to whatever comes next. "Always." "Always," Sarah echoed, and it was a promise they had kept faithfully for all these years. The years rolled on like the Montana seasons, predictable in their cycle but surprising in their details. Freddie married a rancher's daughter from a neighboring spread in 1903, a sensible girl named Catherine, who proved to be an excellent match. They built a house on the far edge of the Reynolds land and worked alongside Frank, learning to eventually take over the operation. Margaret did become a teacher, taking a position at the school her mother had helped establish. She married the new doctor who came to Virginia City in 1905, a young man from Philadelphia named Edward, who reminded Sarah a bit of herself all those years ago, an Easterner trying to find his place in the West. Benjamin went to Helena to learn banking, returning in 1907 to open a branch office in Virginia City. He married a lawyer's daughter and became an important figure in local business, though he always made time to visit the ranch and help with the books. Caroline, true to her childhood fascination, went to nursing school in San Francisco. She returned in 1910 to work alongside her brother-in-law, the two of them forming a formidable medical team. She never married, declaring that she was too busy for such things, though Sarah suspected there was a deeper reason she never shared. Frank and Sarah watched their children build their own lives with satisfaction, and the bittersweet ache that comes with letting go. The ranch was quieter now, though grandchildren began to appear with increasing frequency. Freddie and Catherine had 3 boys in quick succession, and Margaret presented them with twin girls in 1908. "We are a dynasty now," Frank joked, watching his grandsons chase chickens in the yard just as their father had done decades before. "We are a family," Sarah corrected. "That is better than any dynasty." In the summer of 1913, on the 30th anniversary of the blizzard that had brought them together, Frank took Sarah on a trip. He had been planning it for months, keeping it secret despite her attempts to wheedle information out of him. They traveled to Virginia City, where Frank had rented a hotel room, the same hotel where Sarah had stayed before setting out on that fateful journey. After dinner at the nicest restaurant in town, Frank led her to the stable where he had 2 horses waiting. "What are we doing?" Sarah asked, laughing. "You will see," Frank said mysteriously. They rode out of town as the sun set, and Sarah suddenly realized where they were going. Frank was retracing the route she had taken 30 years ago, the journey that had nearly killed her. "Frank," she said softly. "I want to show you something," he said. They rode for an hour in the summer twilight, much easier traveling than Sarah had experienced in that terrible blizzard. Finally, Frank stopped at a spot that looked no different from any other stretch of Montana grassland. "This is where I found you," he said. "Or close enough. I came out here a few weeks ago and marked it." He pointed to a cairn of stones he had built. "This is where our life together really began." Sarah looked around at the peaceful summer landscape, so different from the white hell it had been 3 decades ago. She could barely reconcile the two images, the dying girl she had been and the content woman she had become. "I would have died here," she said. "But you did not," Frank said, dismounting and helping her down. "You lived. We both lived, and we built something worth having." He pulled a small box from his saddlebag and handed it to her. Sarah opened it to find a delicate gold locket inside. She opened the locket and found a tiny photograph of the two of them on one side and all 4 children on the other. 30 years, Frank said. 30 years of loving you. 30 years of building a life together. I wanted to mark it somehow." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "You old romantic." "I thought cowboys were supposed to be tough and stoic." "I am tough and stoic," Frank protested. "But even tough, stoic cowboys can appreciate their wives." Sarah laughed and kissed him, there in the place where she had nearly died and instead found life. The evening wind blew across the grass, warm and gentle, carrying the scent of sage and wildflowers. "Take me home, cowboy," she said. "Which home?" Frank asked. "We have time to make it back to the cabin if you want. It is still standing." Sarah considered. They had kept Frank's original cabin maintained over the years, using it occasionally for the hired men but mostly just preserving it as a reminder of where they had started. "Yes," she decided. "Let's go to the cabin." They arrived as full darkness fell and Frank lit the lamps. The cabin looked almost exactly as it had 30 years ago, though cleaner and with a few more modern conveniences. The same pot-bellied stove, the same rough table, the same bed where Sarah had slept while recovering from near death. "Hard to believe 4 children and 30 years of marriage started in this tiny place," Sarah said, looking around. "Not that tiny," Frank said. "It fit everything we needed at the time." They spread blankets on the floor in front of the fireplace, just as Frank had done that first night, and lay down together watching the flames. But unlike that first night, they were not strangers. They were partners who had spent 3 decades learning every detail of each other. "Tell me what you love about our life," Sarah said, snuggling against Frank's side. "Everything," Frank said. "The big things and the small ones. I love watching you with our grandchildren. I love the way you still mend my shirts even though we can afford new ones. I love how you never fully lost that Boston accent. I love that you became just as much a part of this land as I am." "What else?" Sarah prompted, enjoying this rare moment of extended eloquence from her usually taciturn husband. "I love that we still take walks together. That you still ask me to play the harmonica. That after 30 years I still get excited when I see you coming over a hill." Frank paused. "I love that you made me believe in second chances, that life could be good again." "You gave me first chances," Sarah said. "A chance at a real life, authentic and meaningful. A chance to be brave and strong. A chance to love and be loved completely." They made love that night in the cabin where their relationship had begun, tender and slow, celebrating 30 years of partnership. Afterward, wrapped in blankets and each other, they talked until the fire burned low. "What do you think will happen next?" Sarah asked. "We are not young anymore, Frank. We are in our 60s now." "We grow old together," Frank said simply. "Watch our grandchildren grow. Maybe even meet great-grandchildren if we are lucky. Keep working the ranch as long as we are able. Keep loving each other until the day we die." "That sounds perfect," Sarah said. "It does," Frank agreed. Never thought I would get old with anyone. Figured I would die alone in that cabin, probably frozen in a winter storm. Instead, I get to grow old with you. I would say I am the luckiest man alive, but I think we are both just blessed." "We are," Sarah agreed. "So very blessed." They returned to their main house the next day to find it full of family. Freddie and Catherine had brought the grandsons. Margaret and Edward had arrived with the twins. Benjamin had come from Virginia City with his wife and their infant daughter. Even Caroline had taken time away from the hospital. "What is all this?" Sarah asked, delighted but surprised. "Did you think we would forget?" Margaret said. 30 years married, that deserves a celebration." The family spent the day together, multiple generations gathered around Sarah and Frank's table. There was food and laughter and storytelling, grandchildren playing in the yard while adults reminisced on the porch. Frank played his harmonica and Margaret sang, and everyone joined in for the choruses. As the sun set and the family began to depart, Freddie pulled his parents aside. "Catherine and I have been talking," he said. "We think it is time for you two to start stepping back from the daily ranch work. Let us handle more of it. You have earned a rest." "I am not ready to sit in a rocking chair yet," Frank protested. "Not asking you to," Freddie said. "Just to let us carry more of the load. You built this place. Let us maintain it while you enjoy it." Sarah saw the wisdom in his words, even if Frank was reluctant to admit it. They were getting older. The work that had once been manageable was becoming harder. It would be good to pass the torch to the next generation. "We will think about it," Sarah said diplomatically. Over the following months, they did ease back from the constant demands of ranch work. Frank taught Freddie everything he knew, decades of accumulated wisdom about cattle and land and weather. Sarah spent more time with her grandchildren, teaching the girls to sew and the boys to read. They took up new hobbies. Frank carved intricate figures from wood, creating toys for the grandchildren. Sarah finally had time to read all the books she had been accumulating for years. They traveled a bit, visiting Helena and even making a trip to Seattle to see the ocean. But mostly, they simply enjoyed each other's company. They had been together for so long that they could communicate with a glance, finish each other's thoughts, know what the other needed before they asked. It was a deep, comfortable love, aged like fine wine into something rich and complex. In the autumn of 1918, as the world was ending a terrible war and fighting a devastating flu epidemic, Frank fell ill. It started as a simple cough, but it rapidly worsened. Sarah nursed him anxiously, terrified that after 35 years together, she might lose him. Caroline came to help, bringing all her medical knowledge to bear, but even she could only do so much. Frank had pneumonia, complicated by his age and years of hard work in harsh conditions. For 3 weeks, he hung between life and death. Sarah barely left his side, holding his hand, talking to him even when he was too fevered to respond. She told him about their children and grandchildren, reminded him of all the moments they had shared, begged him not to leave her. On a cold November night, 35 years almost to the day after the blizzard that had brought them together, Frank's fever finally broke. He opened his eyes to find Sarah asleep in a chair beside his bed, still holding his hand. He squeezed it gently, and she woke immediately. "Frank," she breathed, tears streaming down her face. "Thank God, I thought I had lost you." "Not getting rid of me that easy," Frank said, his voice hoarse but steady. "Made you a promise 35 years ago, to love you always. Dying would break that promise." Sarah laughed and cried at the same time, leaning forward to kiss his forehead. "You stubborn, wonderful man." Frank recovered slowly but surely. By Christmas, he was up and around again, though he moved more carefully and tired more easily. The illness had aged him, added a fragility that had not been there before. But his spirit was unchanged, his love for Sarah as strong as ever. They celebrated the new year of 1919 quietly, just the two of them and their immediate family. As midnight approached, Frank raised his glass in a toast. "To second chances," he said, "and first loves, and 35 years of both." "To many more," Sarah added. "To many more," everyone echoed. The years that followed were gentler, slower. Frank and Sarah had truly retired now, leaving the ranch operations to Freddie while they enjoyed the fruits of their decades of labor. They spent their days in quiet contentment, surrounded by family, secure in the legacy they had built. On November nights, when the wind howled around their house, Sarah would sometimes remember that terrible blizzard. She would think about the frightened girl she had been, stumbling through the snow toward certain death. And she would look at Frank, gray-haired and weathered but still strong, still hers, and thank whatever force of fate or luck or divine providence had brought her to his door. In the summer of 1923, exactly 40 years after the blizzard, Sarah and Frank made one last trip to the cabin. It was harder now. They were both in their 70s and feeling their age, but they wanted to mark the occasion, to return to where it all began. They sat on the porch of the old cabin, holding hands and watching the sunset. The land was unchanged, still wild and beautiful and unforgiving. But they had changed. They had grown old together exactly as Frank had promised all those years ago. "No regrets?" Sarah asked. "Not a single one," Frank replied. "You, not one," Sarah confirmed. "I would not change a moment of it. Not the fear, not the cold, not stumbling half dead to your door, because it brought me here to this moment with you." "I love you, Sarah Reynolds," Frank said. 40 years ago, a blizzard forced you to accept a cowboy's shelter. What started as survival became something beautiful. Became everything. Everything, Sarah agreed, leaning her head on his shoulder. It became everything. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars emerged one by one, two people who had started as strangers and become the other half of a whole. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying memories of a storm long past and promises of a future yet to come. In that moment, in that place, they were complete. The journey that had begun with desperation and fear had led to love and legacy, and a life so rich it surpassed anything either of them could have imagined. The blizzard had forced them together, but it was their choice to stay, to build, to love. And that choice, made and remade every day for 40 years, had made all the difference.